again from a very breezy Morton Island down here on the beach, having a bit of a fish in the morning before everything wakes up. Not catching anything, but you know, got to do something to get past the time, don't you? Today we've got a bit of a sad one actually. Going back to the 10th of June 1838 to an incident that happened not far from my hometown, where I grew up in Inverell in northern New South Wales. It's known as the Myall Creek Massacre, where a group of Aboriginals, about 28 of them, were killed by some white stockmen. We were taught about this one in school when I was growing up in history class, and didn't think much of it at the time. But as I got a bit older and learned a bit more history, it sort of occurred to me there was something that wasn't quite right with the way we've been taught it. And it only just a couple of years ago that it actually occurred to me that the reason we were taught it is because it was the first time in Australian history where white people had been hung for the murder of Aboriginal people. And that was the focus of the lesson. It didn't mention much about the massacre at all. So, to set the record straight and maybe do my bit to fix that little anomaly up, I'll tell you all about the real happenings of the Myall Creek Massacre in 10th of June 1838.
So I'll give a bit of a timeline of the events leading up to the massacre to give a bit of an idea of what was actually going on at the time. So in May of 1838, a group of approximately 45 Aborigines from the Kamilaroi Nation had been camped for a few months at McIntyre Station, which had been established on their traditional tribal land. And Charles Kilmeister of Myall Creek Station offered protection for these people, and they accepted, and they set out for Myall Creek in mid-May. On 7th of June, a couple of young stockmen named Andrew Burrows and Charles Reed, who were driving a mob of cattle down to to another station along the river, they stopped in a bell station and they found a large group of stockmen had gathered for the night. They were waiting for a young squatter named John Fleming to join them, and then they were going off hunting Aborigines. John Russell, Bell's head stockman, questioned Burrows and Reed about whether they knew the whereabouts of any Aborigines. They reluctantly acknowledged that there were a group at Myall Creek Station. So Burrows and Reed left Bell's Station to continue their drive on the 8th of June. And eventually Fleming caught up with the rest of the stockmen, and they commenced searching this countryside for Aborigines, just going from station to station, picking up a few extra stockmen along the way. Two blokes, James Lamb and John Blake, joined them. On the 9th of June, Thomas Foster and William Mace from the nearby stations set out for Myall Creek to borrow some Aborigines to cut bark for them at the stations. Meanwhile, Fleming's gang continued to go from station to station looking for Aborigines. They arrived at Newton Station and questioned some of the staff about the whereabouts of any blacks. Again, it was confirmed that there were some at Myall Creek. So Foster and Mace eventually arrived at Myall Creek in the evening, and they explained to Kilmeister that they wanted to borrow 4 or 5 young Aborigines to cut bark for them. So on the 10th of June, Foster and Mace left Myall Creek in the early morning with a few of the Kamilaroi men. Now the Aborigines were worried about allowing the young fellas to go off with a strange white man, and so a couple of the older men, including the leader, King Sandy, decided to go with them and left the rest of the people, mostly women and children, under the protection of Kilmeister. At the same time, John Fleming and his gang of 10 armed stockmen left Hall Station and began riding towards Myall Creek. In the late afternoon, Fleming's gang arrived on the ridge to the west of Myall Creek. Kilmeister and one of the station hands, a bloke named Anderson, were in their huts while the Aborigines were gathering around a campfire. As the gang came riding up to the station huts, the Aborigines were terrified, and they went running into the hut and pleaded to Anderson and Kilmeister for protection. Kilmeister went outside to speak to Fleming and his gang, many of whom Kilmeister knew personally. Anderson waited at the door of the hut, and he couldn't hear what was being discussed, but shortly afterwards, Kilmeister walked away to get his horse. John Russell took a length of rope from his horse and, followed by a couple of the other stockmen, entered the hut. When Anderson asked him what they were going to do, Russell told him he was going to, quote, take the blacks over the back of the range and frighten them. Russell and the other stockmen then entered the hut and began tying the Kamilaroi people's hands together with the whipcord. Women and children were crying and pleading to Anderson to help them, but there was nothing he could do. When all the people were tied or handcuffed to the rope, they were led back out to where the other stockmen remained in front of the hut. At the back of the line was a small Kamilaroi girl who hadn't been tied up, and Anderson managed to grab her and hide her behind the door before going outside and seeing that Kilmister had now returned and had joined Fleming's gang. As they were about to be led away, Davy, a young Aboriginal stockman, spoke up and asked if they would spare a woman for him. And they did, so they cut a young woman free and they gave her to Davy. Anderson then stepped forward and asked if they could spare another woman for him as well, and so they did. And so these two women were freed. Anderson and Davy stood and watched as the rest of the Kamilaroi were being dragged away towards the ridge. A short time later, as the sun was setting, Anderson heard 2 shots. The rest of the Kamilaroi were then slaughtered and dismembered with the 3 swords that the gang had brought with them. One of the women was spared and they took her with them as they rode off into the night, and I don't need to tell you what her purpose was. For the next few days the gang rode around looking for more Aborigines to slaughter. They wanted to catch up with the mob that had been borrowed for bark cutting, and which they caught up to at McIntyre Station. Again, there was another massacre, and not too sure how many people were killed in that event because it wasn't documented. So the absolute callousness of this attack and the fact that Anderson was a white man who had reported the whole affair, at great risk to himself, it's got to be said, it caused an unusually thorough investigation. Eventually the stockmen were arrested and transported to Sydney for trial. There was an enormous uproar from large sections of society, including various newspapers. The Sydney Herald was part owned by a wealthy squatter named Robert Scott, and they took the view that it was ridiculous that white men should be standing trial for the killing of a few blacks. Many people believe the Aborigines were pests, lawless savages who needed to be driven off the land so the colony could continue to expand unhindered. There was even a charity that raised money to help to pay for the defence of the killers. So the first trial took place on the 15th of November 1838 at the Supreme Court of Justice John Dowling. Leading the prosecution was the Attorney General, John Plunkett, and the key witness was George Anderson. Unfortunately, the jury took just 15 minutes to return a verdict of not guilty. However, Plunkett wasn't satisfied with this, and he had the prisoners remanded in custody to stand trial on separate charges arising from the same incident. The second trial took place on the 29th of November 1838 before Justice Burton. This time, Plunkett completely destroyed the credibility of the key witnesses, and eventually the jury returned a verdict of guilty. On the 15th of December, Justice Burton passed sentence on the guilty men. So on 18th of December 1838, Charles Kilmister, John Russell, Edward Foley, John Johnson, James Parry, James Oates and William Hawkins were all hanged for their role in the Myall Creek Massacre. So there you go. Hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you want to be advised when new episodes are posted, just click on the subscribe button that's down there somewhere. If you want to find out what I'm up to, go to my website at warwickoneil.com. If you want to check out my blog site, it's notyouraverageIdiot.net, where I blog on all sorts of things from four-wheel driving, single parenting, whatever comes into my head. So I hope to hear from you soon, and cheers. See ya.